For over a year, I planned everything, begged for effort, and watched him scroll TikTok while our love died. Now I wonder, is it time to finally walk away? When I first met him, I truly believed I had found something special. At 32, I wasn't looking for just a fling anymore. I wanted stability, commitment, someone who would build a real future with me. And here he was, 36, mature, charming, calm. He carried himself with this quiet confidence that made me feel safe. He wasn't overly flashy or loud, and in a world where so many men my age seemed stuck in an extended adolescence, he looked like someone who had grown past all that in the beginning. I let myself get swept up. He took me out on thoughtful dates, dinners where he actually listened, long walks where we talked about everything from childhood memories to favorite music. He laughed at my sarcasm, and for a while, I thought he saw the real me. My friends told me I seemed happier, lighter, as though I had finally let my guard down. But somewhere between the 3-month mark and now, a year and a half later, the shine started to dull. Slowly, subtly at first. He wasn't cruel or abusive, nothing like that. But he became absent. Not physically, maybe, but emotionally. I began to notice the little things. The way he avoided making plans unless I brought them up. The way he grew quieter when I tried to talk about the future. The way his phone seemed to hold more of his attention than I ever could. I brushed it off at first, telling myself that people go through phases, that maybe he was stressed at work, that relationships couldn't always feel like the honeymoon stage. But then the excuses piled up when I suggested we move in together someday. He shook his head almost immediately. Not for at least 2 years, he said, almost like he'd rehearsed it. Living with my ex was a nightmare. I'm not doing that again. His words stung, even though I tried to understand. I told myself it wasn't about me, but deep down, it felt like a rejection. Like he didn't see me as someone different from his past. When we weren't together, he barely texted. Sometimes whole days would pass with only a single good morning message or a quick reply to something I sent. I felt like I was the only one holding a string between us, tugging on it to keep the connection alive. If I didn't plan our weekends, nothing happened. If I didn't call, there was silence. And then came the trip. Nearly 2 weeks on an island. Just the two of us. I thought it would be the reset we needed. Sunsets, beaches, time away from everything. Instead, he spent nearly 80% of the days with his face glued to Instagram and TikTok. I'd sit there next to him, book in hand, hoping he'd notice me, waiting for him to put his phone down and just be with me. But it was always, 1 second, babe, or check this meme. Until hours had slipped away, he complained that we didn't have enough intimacy. But when I explained what I needed, emotional closeness, connection, effort, nothing changed. He wanted the result without the work. And every time I tried to talk about it, to bring up the issues, he would either brush it off with a vague, "we'll see what happens," or change the subject. First, I thought I was being too needy. I questioned myself constantly. Maybe I expect too much, maybe I'm the problem. But the truth is, I wasn't asking for extravagance. I was asking for partnership. And somewhere along the way, I started to realize I might be in this relationship alone. That's when the doubts really began to settle in. And once they did, they were impossible to ignore. As the months rolled on, those early doubts hardened into patterns I couldn't ignore. It wasn't one big fight, one dramatic betrayal that made me question everything. It was the steady drip of neglect, the quiet erosion of effort, the feeling that I was investing in something while he was just coasting. I remember one Saturday vividly. I had planned an entire day for us. Brunch at this little cafe I'd been wanting to try, then a trip to the local market, maybe a walk by the lake. I told him about it earlier in the week, and he'd nodded absent-mindedly, scrolling through his phone as I spoke. The morning came, and I woke up excited, dressed early, coffee in hand, waiting for him to get ready. But when I peeked into the living room, he was sprawled on the couch, half asleep, phone glowing in his hand. "Are you ready to go?" I asked softly, trying to keep my tone light. He groaned. "Do we have to? Can't we just stay in today?" That was his default. Stay in, do nothing, let the hours pass by. If I pushed, he'd come reluctantly, dragging his feet, complaining about the crowds, about the weather, about how tired he was. If I didn't push, then nothing happened at all. Days blurred into evenings where he scrolled endlessly while I sat next to him, pretending the silence didn't hurt. It wasn't just the lack of activity. It was the way he reduced communication to bare bones when we weren't together. Whole weekends would pass where I felt more like an acquaintance than a girlfriend. I'd send him a long message about something that happened at work, pouring my thoughts into it, and his reply would be a single thumbs up emoji. Or worse, nothing at all until I sent a follow-up. And then there were the conversations about the future. Whenever I brought it up, moving in together, plans for marriage, even something as simple as a trip we could take next year, his response was always the same. Let's just see what happens. At first, I thought he was cautious, maybe even wise. But after hearing it for the 100th time, I realized it wasn't wisdom. It was avoidance. He didn't want to commit to anything. What broke me most was the hypocrisy when it came to intimacy. He would complain, sometimes bitterly, that we weren't intimate enough. But when I tried to explain that I needed more than just physical closeness, that I needed conversation, tenderness, connection, he brushed it aside. You're overthinking it, he'd say. Why can't you just relax? But how could I relax when I felt like a placeholder in my own relationship? I began to notice other things too. His circle of friends was almost non-existent. He had acquaintances, sure, but no one close. And when I suggested he come out with mine, to meet the people who mattered to me, he got irritated. Why do I have to be friends with your friends? They're your thing, not mine. It stung. Because wasn't that what relationships were supposed to be? Two lives intertwining, not two parallel lines that barely touched. The cracks widened every day, but he acted like nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, I felt like I was carrying the weight of the relationship on my shoulders, silently screaming for him to notice, to care, to try. And the worst part? Sometimes I wondered if he even realized how much I was hurting, or if he just didn't care. When we booked the trip, I told myself it would be our reset button. 2 whole weeks together on a beautiful island. Sun, ocean, good food, no distractions. I thought maybe, away from the daily grind, he'd finally open up, that we'd find the spark we once had. I was clinging to the idea that all couples go through slumps, and that this was just ours. The first day was magical. We checked into our little hotel, walked along the beach, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is where we turn things around. That night, we had dinner by the water, and for a brief moment, it felt like the man I had fallen for was back. He laughed at my jokes, held my hand across the table, kissed me under the stars. I went to bed hopeful. But the next morning, the illusion shattered that I woke up early. Excited to start the day, already picturing snorkeling, exploring the local markets, maybe renting scooters to see the island. But when I rolled over, he was already glued to his phone, scrolling Instagram, watching TikToks, headphones in, completely detached from the world around him. Hey, I said softly. Let's go down to the beach before breakfast. It looks beautiful this morning. Yeah, in a bit, he mumbled. Eyes still locked on the screen. That bit stretched into hours. By the time he put the phone down, the sun was blazing, the beach was crowded, and the magic I had been holding on to was gone. And that became the pattern. Day after day, he spent most of our trips staring at his phone. While I walked along the shoreline, he sat under the umbrella, laughing at videos I couldn't hear. While I browsed handmade crafts in the markets, he followed behind me with his head down, scrolling. Even at dinner, he'd prop his phone against the glass, checking notifications between bites that I tried to talk to him about it. I told him I felt invisible, that I wanted us to connect, to be here together. He nodded, said he understood, promised he'd try. But the next day, nothing changed. It was like the phone was more important than the woman sitting across from him. What hurt the most was the intimacy, or lack of it. In the rare moments we were together, he'd reach for me physically, complaining about how little intimacy we had, but the emotional connection was gone. I told him, I need more than this. I need you to see me, to talk to me, to act like I matter outside of the bedroom. He shrugged, almost annoyed. You're making this too complicated. Just relax, enjoy yourself. But how could I? When the man I loved was right there, and yet a million miles away. By the end of the trip, I felt lonelier lying next to him than I would have if I'd come alone. 2 weeks on a paradise island, and all I could think was, if we can't be happy here, what chance do we have at home? That vacation was supposed to fix us. Instead, it broke me. Coming back from that trip, something in me had shifted. Before, I had doubts, little nagging thoughts that maybe I was carrying too much of the weight. But now, those doubts had crystallized into certainty. I was giving everything, and he was giving almost nothing back. It wasn't just about the phone, though that was a big part of it. It was about what the phone represented. He could give hours of attention to strangers online, to influencers, to memes that would be forgotten in 5 minutes. But when it came to me, the woman sitting right in front of him, the one planning our days, trying to build a future, I had to beg for scraps of his time. I started to test it, not consciously at first, but little by little. If I didn't text him first, how long would it take before he messaged me? Sometimes it was a whole day. If I didn't suggest plans, what would we end up doing? The answer: nothing. Sitting at his place, eating takeout, half watching a show while he scrolled. If I stopped pushing, the entire relationship stalled. That it felt like being in a boat where I was the only one rowing. My arms ached, my energy drained, and when I looked across at him, he was just sitting there, relaxed, enjoying the ride. I tried to talk to him again. I sat him down one evening and poured my heart out. I told him how I felt invisible, how I needed more than surface-level affection, how I wanted to feel like he actually wanted a life with me, not just a convenient situationship. He listened, or at least he pretended to. He nodded in the right places, even reached out to squeeze my hand. For a few days after that talk, he made a little effort. He texted more, suggested we grab dinner one night. I thought, finally, maybe he heard me this time. But just as quickly as it started, the effort vanished. Within a week, we were back where we had been before. Me begging for connection, him offering empty promises and vague excuses. One night, after another silent dinner where he barely looked up from his phone, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, and the thought hit me so clearly it was almost frightening. This is not what love is supposed to feel like. Love isn't supposed to feel like you're begging to be noticed. It isn't supposed to feel like you're competing with a screen for attention. It isn't supposed to feel one-sided, like all the effort, all the compromise, all the sacrifices are coming from just one person. And the scariest part was that I wasn't even angry anymore. I was just tired. Tired of trying, tired of hoping, tired of convincing myself that things would change. That was the night I realized I had to make a choice. Keep rowing the boat. Until I collapsed, or finally admit that maybe he was never planning to row alongside me. After that sleepless night, I decided I couldn't keep bottling things up. If this relationship had any chance of surviving, he needed to hear me, really hear me. So I made another attempt at a conversation. I planned it carefully in my head, thinking of all the points I wanted to raise, all the examples that showed how distant he'd become. I told myself I wouldn't cry, I wouldn't get angry. I would just lay everything out as calmly as possible. We sat across from each other at his kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I looked at him, phone in hand, as always, and said quietly, "Can we talk?" He sighed, set the phone face down, and leaned back. About what? That response alone stung. About what? As if he didn't know. As if the cracks in our relationship weren't glaringly obvious. So I told him. I told him how it hurt to always be the one planning, how I felt like an afterthought. When he disappeared into his phone, how I needed more effort from him if we were going to build a life together. My voice shook, but I kept going, pouring months of frustration and sadness into that moment. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. I thought maybe he was reflecting, maybe he was finally going to open up, to admit that he'd been coasting and was ready to change. But then he shrugged and said, "You're overthinking again. Things aren't that bad." I wanted to scream. How could he not see? How could he not realize that dismissing my feelings only made things worse? I pressed him, asked what he thought. About our future, about moving in together someday, about whether he even saw me as part of his long-term life. And his answer was the same one I'd heard a dozen times before. "Let's just see what happens." Those words were like poison, not because they were cruel, but because they were empty. They were the perfect shield, vague enough to avoid responsibility, safe enough to shut down the conversation, but hollow enough to leave me with nothing. I pushed harder. "But don't you think we should at least have a plan? Don't you think I deserve to know where this is going?" He rubbed his temples and said, "Why does everything have to be so serious? Can't we just enjoy what we have right now?" It was like talking to a wall. No matter how many times I tried, no matter how vulnerable I made myself, the result was the same: deflection, minimization, avoidance. And every time, I walked away feeling smaller, like maybe I really was the problem. Maybe I was just too demanding, too emotional, too much. But deep down, a louder truth was forming. It wasn't that I was too much. It was that he was giving too little. And yet, despite everything, I stayed. Because I still loved him. Because I still remembered the man who held my hand on that first date. The man who made me laugh until my stomach hurt. I kept clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd come back. But hope can be a dangerous thing when it keeps you chained to someone who has no intention of changing. There's a unique kind of loneliness that comes from being with someone who is physically present but emotionally absent. It's not like being single, where you know you're on your own. It's not like losing someone suddenly, where the grief is sharp and raw. This was different. It was the slow ache of lying next to a warm body and still feeling cold. Nights were the worst. I'd curl up beside him, hoping for closeness, maybe even a simple conversation before sleep. But his routine never changed. He'd turn on the TV, set his phone on his chest, and scroll until his eyelids drooped. Sometimes I'd try to talk, ask about his day, share something funny I'd seen, but I could see the impatience in his eyes, the subtle flicker that said I was interrupting his endless stream of videos. So eventually, I stopped trying. I'd lie there in silence, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of his notifications buzzing while my own thoughts grew louder. Why am I here? Why am I choosing this? Why does this bed feel emptier now than it ever did when I slept alone? Days blurred together in the same pattern. I'd plan little outings just to inject some life into us. A walk in the park, a movie night, a new restaurant. Sometimes he'd come along. Sometimes he'd cancel last minute, claiming he was too tired. I'd go by myself more often then. Not sitting in cafes surrounded by couples laughing and talking, wondering why my own relationship felt so hollow. The hardest part was the comparison between what I gave and what I got. I made him meals, checked in on his day, supported his hobbies even when they bored me. When I struggled, I leaned on myself because I'd learned not to expect comfort from him. If I cried, he grew uncomfortable, muttering something about me being too sensitive before withdrawing that I began to feel like a shadow in my own life. Alive, functioning, but unseen. And yet, to the outside world, we probably looked fine. We still posted the occasional photo, still showed up to family gatherings, still called each other babe. It was the quiet decay behind the curtain that no one else could see that I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since my teenage years. Page after page, I poured out the emptiness I felt, the longing for a love that felt alive instead of stagnant. Reading my own words back to myself was brutal. It was like proof on paper that I couldn't keep lying to myself, and the most painful truth I uncovered in those late-night reflections was this. I was lonelier with him than I had ever been without him. That realization was terrifying, because it meant that being alone wasn't the worst-case scenario. Staying in this half-hearted relationship was. The breaking point didn't come as one explosive moment. It wasn't a screaming match or a betrayal I couldn't forgive. It was quieter than that, more insidious, a slow buildup of disappointments that finally tipped the scale. It started with a small argument. One of those conversations that should have been harmless. I had asked him if we could plan something for the weekend. Just the two of us. No distractions, no phones, no excuses. I thought maybe a hike, maybe cooking dinner together, anything that would feel like us. He barely looked up from his phone and said, "I'm busy, maybe next week." Something inside me snapped. Not in anger, but in clarity. How many times had I heard, "Maybe next week"? How many times had I put my needs on hold, telling myself that patience would pay off? My chest tightened as the weight of all those next weeks came crashing down. That I remember going into the bathroom, shutting the door, and staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked tired, older somehow, not from age but from carrying the exhaustion of being unappreciated. My eyes were red, not from crying just then, but from all the nights before when tears had stained my pillow. And it hit me. This isn't the life I want. That I don't want to beg for love. I don't want to fight for scraps of attention. I don't want to keep building a future with someone who won't even commit to building a weekend. When I came out, I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just sat down on the edge of the couch and said, "I can't do this anymore." He looked at me, finally giving me his full attention for once. His brow furrowed, as if he couldn't believe the words had come from my mouth. "What do you mean?" he asked. I said, my voice steady but my hands trembling. "I can't keep being the only one in this relationship who cares enough to try. I've begged for more. I've explained my needs. I've been patient, and nothing changes. I feel alone, and I can't keep living like this. For a long moment, he said nothing, just sat there, blinking, as if he'd never considered that I might actually leave. And in that silence, I realized something even more painful. He wasn't fighting for me. He wasn't pleading or promising change or even asking me to stay. He just sat there, passive, detached, almost relieved in a strange way, as if my words freed him from having to pretend anymore. That was the moment I knew. Not only was I unloved the way I deserved, but I was also unwanted in the way I longed to be. And there's nothing lonelier than realizing the person you've built your life around doesn't even want to fight for you. After that night, something inside me shifted permanently. It was as if a switch had been flipped. For so long, I had lived in a fog of uncertainty, torn between hope and disappointment, love and loneliness. But now the fog had lifted. I could see everything clearly for the first time. The days that followed were surreal. We went through the motions of being a couple, dinners, shared spaces, the occasional goodnight kiss, but it all felt hollow, like watching actors perform a script they no longer believed in. He scrolled, I planned, and the silence between us grew heavier with every passing hour that I noticed myself pulling back, almost unconsciously. I didn't rush to text him in the mornings. I stopped reminding him of things he'd forget. I stopped making plans. Instead, I gave him the same energy he had given me for months. Nothing. And the result? Nothing changed. He didn't chase me, didn't ask what was wrong, didn't even notice the distance. That silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. Because if I mattered, if our love mattered, he would have noticed. He would have fought. But he didn't point. One evening, I sat at my desk with my journal open and wrote down everything I felt. Page after page, I listed the things I had asked for: love, attention, effort, a future, and next to them, I listed what I had received: excuses, avoidance, indifference. When I read it back, I realized that staying with him was a choice to keep living half a life. The decision crystallized in that moment. I couldn't stay. Not for convenience, not for history, not for the faint hope that things might someday change. My heart deserved more than scraps. My soul deserved more than silence. But leaving wasn't just about walking out the door. It was about breaking the chains of guilt I had wrapped around myself. I had convinced myself for so long that I was the problem. Too needy, too emotional, too demanding. Writing it all out showed me the truth. I wasn't asking for too much. I was asking the wrong person. The hardest part was mourning the version of him I had fallen in love with. The man who made me laugh, who looked at me like I was the only person in the room, who dreamed out loud in those first few months. That man was gone, or maybe he never truly existed beyond the honeymoon stage. What I had left was someone content to let me do all the work, someone who would rather lose me than put his phone down for an hour. I remember whispering to myself, almost like a mantra, it's okay to leave. It's okay to want more. It's okay to stop fighting for someone who won't fight for you. That night, I packed a small bag. Just essentials. I wasn't sure if I'd walk out tomorrow or the day after, but I needed to feel the weight of that choice in my hands. As I zipped the bag shut, I felt a strange mix of grief and freedom. I was mourning the relationship, yes, but I was also reclaiming myself. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully. The morning I finally left wasn't cinematic. There were no suitcases dramatically slammed shut, no tearful pleas at the doorway. It was quiet, painfully, almost eerily quiet. He was still asleep when I got up, and I remember standing there for a moment, watching him breathe. I tried to search his face for some trace of the man I fell in love with, the man who had once made me feel like the luckiest woman alive. But all I saw was indifference. Even in his sleep, he looked distant. I left a short note on the kitchen counter. Nothing poetic or accusatory. Just, I can't do this anymore. I need to choose myself. Please don't call. I slipped my bag over my shoulder, walked out the door, and closed it softly behind me. That sound, the latch clicking into place, felt like the final chapter of a book I had been trying to finish for far too long. At first, there was relief. I sat in my car and just breathed. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt light. The tension in my chest loosened. The constant knot in my stomach began to unravel. I wasn't in limbo anymore. The decision was made, but as the hours turned into days, the grief hit. I cried into my pillow at night, missing not him exactly, but the idea of him. The future I had built in my mind, the shared apartment, the trips, The lazy Sundays that never really existed. All of it collapsed like a house of cards. And mourning a dream can be even harder than mourning a person. He texted me a few times in the beginning. Nothing dramatic. Just, "Are you okay?" And, "I don't get why you left like that." I ignored them, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to say. We had said it all, and he had shown me enough with his silence long before I ever packed that bag. Friends asked what happened, and I struggled to explain. How do you tell people that you left because of emptiness? That you couldn't keep living in a relationship where love felt one-sided, where indifference hurt more than cruelty ever could? Some understood. Others said, "But he didn't cheat. He didn't hit you. He wasn't a bad guy." And that was the hardest part. He wasn't a monster. He just wasn't enough. And sometimes, not enough can break you just as much as betrayal. The first weekend alone, I sat on my couch surrounded by takeout containers and silence. I thought I'd feel empowered, but instead I felt raw. I questioned myself. Had I overreacted? Was I too demanding, too impatient? But deep down, I knew the answer. I hadn't asked for too much. I had simply asked the wrong person. Slowly, though, things began to change. I picked up old hobbies, met with friends I hadn't seen in months, and relearned what it meant to enjoy my own company. I discovered that laughter could come easily again, that peace could exist without walking on eggshells. And through it all, one truth became clearer than anything else. Leaving him wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of finally writing my own. Weeks after leaving, I finally began to feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. The fog of doubt that had clouded me for so long started to clear, and I could see myself again, not just as someone's girlfriend, not as someone constantly begging for attention, but as me. I remember sitting in a coffee shop one Saturday morning, watching couples around me laugh, argue playfully, or share quiet moments. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel jealous. Instead, I felt hopeful. I realized I wasn't broken, and I wasn't unlovable. I had simply been giving all my love to someone who couldn't, or wouldn't, return it. Looking back, I saw how many red flags I had ignored. How many times I had convinced myself to just be patient, or not make a big deal out of it. But ignoring my own needs hadn't saved the relationship. It had only delayed the inevitable. And then, something powerful happened. I stopped blaming myself. I stopped replaying every moment wondering what I could have done differently. The truth was simple. Love should never feel like begging. It should never feel like silence when you need a voice, or distance when you need closeness. Did I love him? Yes. But love, on its own, isn't enough. It can't sustain a relationship if there's no effort, no growth, no shared vision for the future. What I wanted wasn't unreasonable. Intimacy, connection, partnership. Those are the foundations of love, not luxuries. Sometimes I still think about him. Not with longing, but with a quiet sadness. I hope he figures himself out. I hope he learns how to put his phone down and truly see the person sitting across from him. But whether he does or not is no longer my responsibility. My responsibility is to myself. To rebuild. To dream again. To believe that one day, I'll find someone who doesn't just occupy space in my life, but fills it with warmth and presence. Someone who fights for me the way I fight for them. Walking away wasn't easy. It tore me apart in the beginning. But in the end, it saved me. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't staying and trying harder. It's knowing when to leave, even if it breaks your heart, and trusting that healing will come. And for me, it has. Thank you for watching this story on True Tales Hub. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. We post new tales twice a day, and each one comes with unexpected twists you won't see coming.